Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Audit Committee meeting of Thursday, the 28th of June, 2018. Is there any declarations of interest from committee members?
No, sir.
No? Thank you. Confirmation of the minutes number 16 of June 14th, 2018. Are the minutes confirmed? They should be fresh in everybody's mind. That was just a little while ago. Okay, thank you. There are two reports from the Auditor General on the agenda today. The AG has a presentation for each item, therefore we will hold both items. At the discretion of the Chair and at the will of this committee, we will begin with item 2 of the agenda. Before we proceed to item 2, I will ask the Vice Chair, Councillor Cloutier, to read the motion to add the supplementary documentations for item 1 and 2 to the agenda.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair. Whereas the supporting documentation titled Office of the Auditor General, Fraud and Waste Hotline, and Review of the City's Practices for the Procurement of Commercial Vehicles were not circulated with the agenda package. Therefore, be it resolved that the Audit Committee approve the addition of these documents for consideration by the Committee at today's meeting pursuant to Section 89.3 of the Procedures Bylaw, being Bylaw 2016-377.
Okay, thank you. Now, so we'll proceed to item 2. Mr. Hughes, welcome, and if you'd like to proceed with your presentation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Comme vous avez dit, Monsieur le Président, aujourd'hui, nous sommes ici pour présenter deux rapports. Le premier sera l'examen des pratiques de la ville relative à l'acquisition de véhicules commerciaux. Et deuxièmement, comme nous avons fait chaque juin, le rapport annuel 2017 sur la ligne directe de fraude et d'abus. En 2015 et 2016, des signalements ont été faits à la ligne directe de fraude et d'abus, soulevant des inquiétudes quant à des abus relativement à l'achat des fourgonnettes commerciales de marque Mercedes.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. In late 2015, a report was filed with the city's Fraud and Waste Hotline. This report raised concerns related to waste and purchases of Mercedes commercial vans. The report questioned why the city was buying what they believed to be the most expensive commercial van on the market. The inquiry also asked whether or not a cost-benefit analysis was done to ensure the purchases were cost-effective, and why the city was not buying vans made in Canada. These reports were provided to the city manager's office to be investigated. This investigation was done and the report was reviewed by our office. We made requests for further supporting information, and upon reviewing that information, we decided to conduct our own investigation. As well, in late 2016, another fraud and waste report, which alleged the use of rental vehicles during a discretionary spending freeze in 2015, came to our attention through the Fraud and Waste Hotline. We included that report as well in our review. These items formed the objectives of our review. The scope of our review included the city's acquisition of Mercedes Sprinter vans from 2011 to 2015, including all relevant documentation to support the city's decision to acquire the vans. Transit fleet vehicles were included in scope, as well as rental vehicles and costs incurred in 2015. We excluded the vans purchased by Ottawa Police Service and Ottawa Hydro fleet vehicles. During this period of time, the city purchased 71 Mercedes Sprinter vans and leased one. 35 were purchased by Transit. One was leased by Traffic Services for LRT work, and the remainder were purchased under the fleet unit.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons constaté que les raisons de l'achat de fourgonnettes Sprinter de Mercedes n'étaient pas justifiées dans les documents d'approvisionnement examinés. Les explications étaient de haut niveau et aucune n'était appuyée par une analyse de la valeur.
We reviewed bid documents associated with the purchases. We found that some of the bid documents specified the vehicle model, which would be Sprinter. During that period of time, the Sprinter name was only known to be associated with the Mercedes Sprinter vans. Although the brand isn't specified, the model restricted and precluded all suppliers except for Mercedes. In our interpretation of the procurement bylaw, this would have contravened the bylaw, as the bylaw states that procurement documentation shall avoid the use of specific products or brand names. There is an exception in the bylaw. The bylaw does indicate that a director may specify a specific product or brand name for essential functionality purchases to avoid unacceptable risk or for some other valid purpose. We did not find documentation to support this exception, nor did we find a value analysis comparison conducted to provide assurance that these vehicle specifications were required, that there was a valid purpose, and that there was a specified need that these Mercedes vans would be essential to city operations. When reviewing other documentation around the procurement of the vans, we found that the reasons for purchasing them could not be explained in the procurement documentation reviewed. Explanations were high level and none were supported by value analysis. When I describe value analysis, what we would hope to see, and what is also noted in the procurement bylaw, would be some sort of financial analysis that provides the life cycle cost of the Mercedes van versus the type of van that was being replaced that was suitable for the operations previously. The analysis would need to determine that the additional cost, the higher cost of the replacement Mercedes vans was justified by things like increases in productivity or other essential reasons that we would have expected to justify the higher cost. And that type of documentation analysis was not done and was not provided to the audit team. We also noted circumstances where Mercedes Sprinter vans were purchased when an initial vehicle requirement form, and that's the form that's filled in that details what's required to replace a vehicle that's basically come to the end of its life. We found in some cases that the initial forms detailed a less expensive van was identified to be sufficient for replacement. We did see in those cases that the ultimate van that was purchased was the Mercedes Sprinter van, and we could not, again, be provided with justification or a value analysis to support the additional cost of that van. In some of those, we saw the replacement forms were changed. So the initial forms indicated a lower cost van. The vans weren't purchased at that time. 2 years later, the forms were changed, and the identification of the lesser cost van was eliminated, but the initial rationale that the existing vehicle was too large still remained, and the Mercedes vans didn't meet that requirement. We did note that those forms could be improved, better explanations and justifications could be provided to ensure that the most cost-effective vehicles are selected. As well, between May 2015 and August 2015, 7 Mercedes Sprinter vans were purchased when a more economical option existed. So at the time of the original RFT in 2010-2011, the only high roof cargo van on the market was the Mercedes. But in 2012, another entrant entered the market. It was a Nissan van. And in 2013, there was a third option, which was a Chrysler van, Ram ProMaster van, all of similar design, high roof cargo vans. Ford entered the market in 2015, and that's where we saw a change in the procurement. However, we found about 7 vans that were purchased after Ford vans had started to be procured, and the cost difference we analyzed was almost 7 vans. The city could have saved approximately $167,000. The other item analyzed was an analysis done by Fleet Services in the calculation of net capital savings. And really what that means is they looked at the purchases of 29 Mercedes Sprinter vans and looked at what was being replaced and then did an analysis in terms of cost. Was the Sprinter van a lower cost replacement or a higher cost replacement? The initial analysis showed that there were cost savings of approximately $462,000. We independently conducted our own review using data from the city's systems and vetted that with Fleet Services. Our analysis had a much lower cost savings overall, which was $159,000. But when you look at the analysis as a whole, you have the perception that overall this was a good decision and that these cost savings were justified. However, when we looked at it more closely, we found that for 12 of the 29 vans purchased, there were cost savings. They were much larger vehicles, and the Mercedes vans did represent a lower cost and a savings of a little over $500,000. However, when we looked at a number of other vehicles, and there were approximately 14, the Mercedes vans represented a higher cost, and the loss we calculated was close to $400,000. So looking at it at a net basis is not really providing a clear picture and understanding of where you could have saved money, and in the clear cases where they did. As I mentioned earlier, we did not find evidence of value analysis performed prior to purchases. As well, in the procurement bylaw, there's a requirement that supply services would request a value analysis. When we interviewed the folks from Fleet and Supply Services, they did confirm that the value analysis were not done and were not requested. And these are very clearly stated in the bylaw, which we've noted in our report. And finally, the fraud and waste report that was sent to the city manager's office to look at this waste report, the investigation was done primarily by Fleet Services, and it was reviewed by the deputy city manager's office at the time. As auditors and lawyers, we naturally look at conflicts and potential bias when we see analysis done this way. It's not necessarily a natural question that others may ask themselves when doing this type of work. But in our view, in terms of reviewing and investigating decisions made by a unit, it should not necessarily be done by that unit. There is bias involved when essentially you're reviewing and justifying decisions that were made by that particular unit. I would like to acknowledge, though, that the report and the information was reviewed and approved by the deputy city manager's office. We did make a recommendation in this regard. Meetings have already taken place to discuss how we can change and improve these procedures, and that's already underway. Finally, a couple of items that we had wanted to bring to management's attention. When we reviewed invoices against the pricing schedule and agreements for the contracts for purchases, we had difficulty actually matching the invoice to the pricing schedules and agreements. And this is, I think, most people here have probably bought a car. The agreement had base pricing, and there were certain options included in base pricing. For some of the invoices we reviewed, it appeared as though some of the options that should have been included in the base price actually had a price associated with. And our concern was that there's a risk that if the invoices aren't closely reviewed against the pricing schedule, that the city could be paying for options that should be already included as per the contract. Reports to Standing Committee and Council. There are pre-budget reports that are provided in advance for any acquisition of any growth or replacement vehicles. This has been done since the motion was passed in 2005, and the fleet unit has been providing these reports to committees. We did find that the same information is not being provided by transit, and we have recommended that they also abide by that motion, as it did state that it should include any branch of the corporation of the City of Ottawa. And finally, the vehicle rentals. When we examined the vehicle rentals, we looked at the guidelines around the discretionary spending freeze that was in place, and this was in 2015 for approximately half of the year. From our understanding, the rental expenses for vehicles would be considered operational activities, and these did not form part of that discretionary spending freeze. So therefore, the freeze would not have applied to operational needs for rental vehicles. We also found, we looked at essentially a trend analysis on the expenses for rental vehicles, and when we looked at the period from 2013 to 2016, we actually found a significant decrease year over year in rental costs. So we did not conduct any further work on that area. We made 8 recommendations in the report that represent improvements that can be made to ensure that there are efficiencies and adequate value analysis. Management has agreed to those, and some of the work has already begun on those recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to skip 8 if you remember. La ligne directe a été créée pour permettre des employés de ne pas laisser sans crainte de représailles. Elle menait des enquêtes sur les fraudes présumées conformément à les politiques en matière de fraude et d'abus de conseil. Initially, the Fraud and Waste Hotline was set up to give a voice to employees in an atmosphere, in a method that would ensure that there were no repercussions. And in 2009, Council opened the Fraud and Waste Hotline to residents and suppliers. I can confirm that the purpose of the Fraud and Waste Hotline is to ensure that any allegations of fraud and waste are investigated, and I think the past history of the line, the Fraud and Waste Hotline, has confirmed that it's been working well. Des exemples de fraude incluent falsification ou utilisation abusive des biens, de l'équipement, des matériaux, des dossiers, de temps de travail ou de réseau municipal. Examples of fraud include theft or forgery. It includes staff taking items that have been lost and found instead of putting them in through the lost and found. It includes filing false time reports, working elsewhere while on leave, whether that's short-term leave or long-term disability. It includes using confidential information for non-authorized purposes. And includes submitting false data during your work. Des exemples d'abus incluent surutilisation des ressources ou des employés sans affectation. Cependant, l'abus vu au-delà de ces exemples, tout ce qui nuit au bon fonctionnement du milieu de travail constitue de l'abus. Un superviseur qui est irrespectueux d'intimidation des collègues ou des frictions de toutes sortes peuvent mener à des abus. Examples of waste include activities that are not performed effectively or efficiently because of substance abuse while on the job, employees that are not assigned, or employees who are assigned and don't perform the work that they're assigned to. And certainly, our view is that anything in the workplace that affects efficient operations is waste. A disrespectful supervisor, or bullying and harassment of coworkers, or any type of friction in the workplace can lead to waste. La politique s'applique à tous ces employés de la Ville d'Ottawa, sauf les conseillers et le personnel de leur bureau. Aussi au personnel de la Société de logement communautaire d'Ottawa, qui ne sont pas inclus dans la ligne directe, mais la Société de logement a maintenant sa propre ligne directe qui s'appelle la portail intégré. The fraud and waste hotline applies to all City Hall employees except councillors and their office staff, police service, the public library, and the Community Housing Corporation. But for a couple of years now, with our assistance, the Community Housing Corporation now has its own hotline, known as the Integrity Portal. And any reports that come in through our hotline are provided to the Community Housing Corporation. The role of the Office of the Auditor General is to administer the hotline. We are the corporate expertise in fraud examination. There are currently 3 certified fraud examiners in the office. Remembering, Mr. Chair, that 95% of the investigations are done by management. We review the reports, and as you've heard here, in some instances we may ask that additional work be done, or in some cases we may look in more detail at some of the investigations that are done by management. We provide yearly reports to Council. Now, staff are obligated to report violations of the fraud and waste policy. And as I indicated, because most investigations are done by management with some direction on our part, and certainly when the results are given to us, there are certainly occasions where we ask for further information. But when you consider the number of investigations that are done by management and the few times where we have to perform another investigation, I would have to say that they're well done on the part of management. I'd like to remind the Audit Committee that the Fraud and Waste Hotline has been in place for more than 10 years. It's one of the longest running ones in the country. It's confidential. The website is mobile friendly. It operates 24/7 and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's totally confidential and anonymous, and it's operated by a third party. Monsieur le Président, ici on a une représentation des signalements par an. On peut noter qu'il y a eu une baisse considérable du nombre de signalements reçus pendant 2016. C'est une diminution de 33%. Mr. Chair, this is representation of the volume of reports received by year. We can see that there are ups and downs, and there's been a decrease in reports received this year, a decrease of about a third. Il y a des raisons qui pourraient expliquer la baisse du nombre de signalements. Peut-être l'amélioration possible du comportement du personnel ou à cause des autres mécanismes qui existent à les villes. There's a number, I'll let Deputy Auditor General Ed Minor take us through the details in the fraud and waste report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to start by talking about the decline in the number of reports that were received this year versus last year. And I guess we never know exactly why that was the case, although there are a number of possible reasons we should want to point out. The first is that it is, certainly possible that there's improved behavior on the part of staff, and that the message from the previous fraud and waste reports is gradually getting through, and that there's less activity to report. There are also other reporting mechanisms. Of note, the city has a complaint reporting mechanism. The city also has the violence and harassment in the workplace policy and procedures that exist. And some reports that may have gone to the hotline in the past may be going through these vehicles. We do note, however, it is a challenge to find the link to the fraud and waste hotline from Ottawa.ca. It's a bit of a challenge. You can find it using the search engine, but outside of that, it is a challenge. And also the communication plan and promotion. It's been a long time since we've gone back out to the city's employees to remind them about the hotline, And so we think there might be a need for a refresh in that regard, just to make sure that employees are aware of the line and their responsibilities. I don't know if you recall when we were here in talking about the long-term care investigations, that most of the employees that we spoke with were not aware of the fraud and waste hotline, nor that it should be used for matters other than financial fraud. This gives information on the source of our reports. And you can see the public makes, this past year came in with 60% of the reports, which is roughly the same as it was in 2016. And now looking at how the reports are submitted, because they can be submitted on the website through the internet or through a telephone answering service. And so on the web, we're close to 70% are received through the internet site, and it's an increase a bit from last year. I think it was 65% in 2016, and so. Given that so much of it is coming through the website, we did a bit of a refresh last year to change the look of it. So for someone logging onto the website, they'll see a different look and I'd like to think a bit more modern. I think we have an example there. It's that theme kind of carries through the website. We think it's a bit more modern. So. But should stress that the underlying functionality hasn't changed. It's just the graphics in this case. Now looking at reporters who subsequently access their report. The reporter there's a facility in there once they've made a report that they can be notified if they provide an email address, if we require any further information from them, or to get back on what has happened when we close out the report. And so for reporters who do go back to access their report, you see it's roughly about 45%. So roughly half of the people who use the system go back to find out what happened or provide additional information. So we can continue to see that's a valuable function that's provided. Looking at our investigations that are underway, at the end of 2017, we had 40 investigation reports in progress with investigations underway. And that's basically the same as what we started the year with. I think we have 41. So the gist of it is that we're closing the reports at about the same pace we're receiving them. Starting in 2017, we began to categorize each report as we closed it. And this give us additional information and provide the committee with more information on what happens when we close these reports. And of the 193 that we closed, we found that 39 of them were substantiated. And that means that the allegation that was made in the report was accurate and that it constituted fraud or waste. We had 48 reports that were not applicable, so the allegation was not under the purview of the OAG. We had 41 reports with insufficient information, so the allegation was basically unclear or did not provide enough information to be investigated. And then we had 36 reports that were accurate but compliant. So, in other words, the reporter correctly observed something, but when we investigated, what they observed was not against city's rules and procedures. And lastly, we had 29 reports where we found the allegation to be inaccurate. Now, for the fraud and waste reports that we closed, the issues that arose, I guess they're the standard ones we see most years. We have theft and related issues, unauthorized use or misuse of city property and time, violations of laws, regulations, policies and procedures. And we also had a case involving manipulation and falsification of data. talking about recommendations, one of the reports that we investigated resulted in us making 3 recommendations to improve the city's procedures. It turns out in this case it was actually not a substantiated report. However, while we were looking at it, we did identify opportunities to improve procedures, and city management agreed with all 3 of those recommendations. And I should add that there were 3 cases that were reported separately to the Audit Committee during 2017 that came as a result of the Fraud and Waste Hotline reports. I think you may recall there was the Giver 150 playground at Mooney's Bay. There was an investigation of 3 reported shortages at client service centers. And there was the review of the the emergency shelter providers. So that, again, we did that and brought that forward in November of 2017. So we're just noting that here because that originally came through a fraud and waste report. And lastly, I should add that during 2018 already we have brought forward there were the 2 long-term care reports that originated through the Fraud and Waste Hotline that we did it was in March. The incident related to abuse and the incident on the control of control of medications. And today we just brought the review of the procurement of commercial vehicles.
Mr. Chair, I'll just go through a couple examples of some of the reports that are found in some of the issues that were identified that were brought forward by reporters. An employee engaged in various activities while receiving long-term disability benefits, which appeared to be inconsistent with the medical condition. The long-term disability benefit was terminated and the employee was retired. An employee was leaving work early and submitting falsified data reports. The employee was terminated. Due to the falsified reports, data from 90 completed activities needed to be deleted, and staff are repeating them. An employee failed to provide supporting documentation for uncertified sick leave. The employee resigned, and the city will recover the hours advanced. There were 11 cases of violation of laws, regulations, policies, and procedures. One example, an employee was giving confidential information to employees and friends to help them pass provincial tests. The employee may even have completed at least part of one of the tests on behalf of another employee. The employee was terminated and the applicable provincial ministry notified. The employee that received assistance to complete their exam is under investigation. There were 2 other cases of cash discrepancies at client services centers. One was 500, the other was 200. Management and the OAG investigated but were unable to identify the individuals responsible. Management concluded that the cause of the shortage was human error. Management met with all staff at 3 of the large client service centers to outline the importance of adhering to the cash handling policies, to set out expectations and accountabilities, and to outline the disciplinary actions that will result for non-compliance. There were 4 cases of theft, embezzlement, and fraud. A family member did not advise the City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund of the death of a pensioner. Court proceedings for criminal charges against the family member are ongoing. In addition, a civil claim against a family member has been initiated. CUSF has changed the process for following up on annual declaration of survival forms to stop pension payments when the forms are not signed and returned. A counter deposit was $400 short due to a suspected fraud committed by a client. Management suspects no wrongdoing on the part of any city staff and no further internal investigation is planned. The police investigated and charges were laid against the client. The suspected fraud was made possible by an employee not following procedures. The employee has been reminded of the cash handling policy. While on duty, an employee stole a patient's medication. The employee was suspended and charged criminally. Upon completion of the diversion direct accountability program, the charges were withdrawn. Minutes of settlement covering disciplinary action were signed by the employer and the union, and the employee was reinstated. There were a number of cases, 3 where we identified suggestions for improvement. Possible opportunities were identified to improve winter maintenance operations within the road services branch, specifically in the areas of salt usage and snowbank removal. Amongst other changes being implemented for the winter season past, city management committed to delivering salt management training to staff, improving the monitoring of salt usage, and developing a process to provide consistent direction for initiating snow removal. Our office received allegations regarding missing possible theft of hockey sticks at an arena. This is a report where we investigated initially, looking to see if there were if there were threats occurring of hockey sticks, remembering that hockey sticks these days don't cost 99 cents like they used to when I'd go to Canadian Tire. We're talking about $200, $300, $400 sticks. When we did the investigation, we found really issues surrounding how lost and found articles were being handled, and that the policy around lost and found wasn't being appropriately followed by staff, and that it was possible for items that should have been made available for the return of lost items to individuals. That wasn't happening. Staff were reminded of the procedures, and city management agreed to implement the recommendations. There was one case where an employee was inappropriately handling controlled substances and falsified documents, and that employee was terminated. Monsieur le Président, en sommaire, la ligne directe est une pratique exemplaire, mais un des principaux avantages de la ligne directe, c'est qu'elle continue de contribuer à l'amélioration de la culture d'intégrer à la ville d'Ottawa. Mr. Chair, in summary, the City of Ottawa, with the use of a hotline, is following a best practice. According to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, a confidential hotline is the #1 method to identify fraud and waste. 40 to 46% of all frauds are found through tips given to a fraud and waste hotline, versus 30% that can be identified through the joint actions of both an audit, the joint versus versus 30% which can result from the combined efforts of both an audit group and management. Fraud and Waste Hotline also identifies areas for improvement, and certainly discourages potential activities on those individuals that might be considering doing things that they should not be doing. As mentioned during the presentation on the review of the city's practices for the procurement of commercial vehicles, we will work with the city manager's office to update the procedures to investigate reports that allege waste, and we are working closely with the city manager's office to look at improvements to the publication of the Fraud and Waste Hotline. Mr. Chair, I'd like to take this moment to mention that one of our employees, a long-term employee of the Office of the Auditor General, who's been there since the beginning, Suzanne Bertrand, is retiring this fall. And she's the backbone of the Fraud and Waste Hotline. She's a very important part of the operation of this hotline. She can take full credit for ensuring that the Fraud and Waste Hotline is what it is today. We'll certainly miss her, and we're grateful for her participation so far. Thank you, Suzanne. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank city staff for their continued cooperation and assistance. And now, Mr. Chair, we'd be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Auditor General, and thank you to your team, and congratulations to Suzanne on her retirement. I think for the purposes, we're going to go back to report number 2 and start there with questions and comments. Would the city manager or your staff like to make any comments on report number 2?
Mr. Chair, no, we'll just deal with the questions as they come up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So starting off the questions, Councillor Wilkinson.
make some notes on this, but anyway. One of the things was in here was about the policy that the city did, the motion in 2005, I believe it was. And it was a city motion. I don't know if it was just directed to the wrong place, but it seemed strange to me that some city departments were doing it and some were not. I just don't understand why that happened that way. Did you find that out in your investigation?
Mr. Chair, it was certainly a question that we put to staff, and it was clearly a situation where some staff were not aware of that motion. And I guess when you consider how the various departments report to various committees, that possibility always exists that not every motion that has broader applicability might not be communicated to all city staff.
But didn't all of these ones go through our procurement policy, which means our procurement office, because they knew about it, because they used it elsewhere? I just think there's maybe an internal communication problem, which I know does exist within this city because of its size. But I think something that is basic as that, which is to get proper quotes and do proper analysis, should have not even had been in the policy to start with. But I'm aware in the past that sometimes managers would say, I want this, I saw this, and this is right, but I need it, I'm going to get it, and they would do it. And I think this is saying, be cautious about that, because I think it's cost the city a lot more money, not just in these departments, but in other operations when they do that. And it doesn't necessarily even mean we get the best product even. It's not just money, it's other things that come into it, as you know. And if there's a reason that this one has better seats for people that they won't get back problems, then that becomes an issue that is important to include. But it has to be something of that nature. You identified it, and I'm glad you did, but I'm really puzzled that it's now 13 years later. That's a long time. I guess you can't answer that very well, management. I don't know if they can either, because a lot of them are different now.
I'll answer that, because I actually helped Councillor El Chanturi draft that motion way back when, that there be an annual reporting before the budget on the vehicles that are going to be purchased. Unfortunately, the reality is they only know the vehicles that are going to be replaced, not what they're going to replace them with, because we go through a procurement process. That list is actually compiled by Fleet Services. It's not compiled by procurement, because procurement only gets involved once Fleet Services has determined which vehicles are going to be replaced. Unfortunately, the breakdown in communications comes because Transit works as a separate organization. They do their own purchasing because they're basically buying buses. They do buy some light fleet, but basically they're buying buses. So Transit is the group that was not providing their information, and our Fleet Services group were just providing the information that they had available. So we've rectified that, and in the future, the fleet group in Transit will also be identifying vehicles that they're planning on replacing in the current year.
And also ones that are new, as we do sometimes increase our fleets.
Yes, if we've got growth vehicles, those are also identified in that particular report. We're going to actually change the process so that that's actually going to come to you at the time you're doing the budget, so you can see the relationship. Sometimes it comes to you months in advance and it sort of gets forgotten, but we'll include it as supplemental to the budget so you can consider it at the time you're dealing with the budget.
Okay. And I take it in doing that, they would then be doing this evaluation, which the Auditor General has identified, which would include life expectancy of vehicles and things, all of which are part of the costing of it.
Definitely. We are doing a significant exercise right now to actually look at when we should be replacing vehicles. And growth vehicles are a little bit of a different animal, but when you should be replacing vehicles. And we agree with the auditor that we need to increase the documentation with respect to when we make a change in the type of vehicle that we're using. In the particular audit that they looked at, we actually downsized a number of vehicles, which is why there was the savings to go into the high-top vans. but in a number of cases we increased the size of it, and we need to make certain that we've got good, clear justification where we actually increase the cost to the city. But this all reflects from the need of the client, what they need to actually deliver the job in the most efficient manner possible. So we agree the documentation does need to be enhanced, and we will be doing that, putting that in place for the 2019 budget.
And does that include longevity? I know at one point they said in 5 years we've got to replace that vehicle. It was all done by a number of years, not on necessary. And we've occasionally said, no, it can go another year longer. And some vehicles are used more than others, and so they'll be variable. And I always thought it was a bit strange that you didn't look at, like I have an 8-year-old car that still works perfectly, and I'll use it until it doesn't work perfectly. I'm not having high maintenance costs or anything else. So you do need to know with each vehicle, it's analysis a bit, but also they know the operation, they know which ones are not doing well, etc.
Councillor, you'll be glad to hear that the model that Fleet Services have been working on considers all kinds of factors. It takes the history of every vehicle in terms of its maintenance. It takes the mileage. It takes the years. All of those types of things go into consideration when we're trying to come up with what's the optimal mix of vehicles that need to be replaced in any given year. And you're absolutely right. There, when we get the list, if it's beyond what we can actually afford, then we say, okay, so what are the ones what are the top priorities and what are the lowest priorities, and where can we cut to make that decision to fit within what we have available that's the most economical for the city. Because you don't want to be making decisions about like you said, replacing on years alone, if in fact the years are irrelevant because the vehicle doesn't get the usage. Or in other cases we have where in 5 years' time a vehicle will have 120,000 kilometers on it. They're used extensively and they're driven hard, so they need to be replaced. So we're taking that all into consideration in the model, and hopefully we'll have a much better report to you on what we need to replace and why.
I don't think 120,000 kilometers means anything these days. The vehicles go a lot further than that. Anyway, I hope that it's done. I think, anyway, have to be able to run. I understand all of that, but our budget is we're so tight always that the more we can make efficiencies here, the better off it is. So I appreciate the work they're doing. And that's the report that says it's coming back in Q3 or something.
We will be reporting back as part of the budget, so for 2019. So given the election, it'll actually be most likely in early 2019 that you see the results of that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, on that one. The only other thing I wanted to comment about the fraud, are they just doing the checks now?
We're just going to do report 2 first, because we need to carry that, and then we'll go into the fraud and waste. So if you have questions for that, I'll put you on the list.
The key ones. I think there's other information here that's quite interesting, but that's really on recommendation 7 about the life cycle costs, and that's what I was just addressing. And I very much think that is a good recommendation, and that that all the departments now are going to be involved. I guess indirectly, the ones that are associated, like Library Board, which uses our procurement system often, I think they
Councillor Wilkinson, we're going to do the fraud and waste report after.
Not part of your mandate.
Yeah. Councillor Wilkinson, we're going to do that after the fraud and waste report. We're just dealing with the commercial vehicles right now.
Number 7, still. Because he says they don't do every city operation, only the ones that are directly under the city. That's why things like Library Board, which are basically almost city operations, but with a separate board, are not part of this. They don't have a lot of vehicles anyway, but
They would benefit from any changes to the procurement program as well.
okay, they will. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Minette?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 3, it's noted that staff indicated in 2015 purchase of 29 Mercedes Sprinters would result in savings of $462,000. However, the savings that were found were $159,000. How could it be so much difference in calculations, and where did the $462,000 come from?
There were a number of areas in the analysis that were different. One example was that if the vehicle was a like-for-like replacement, they just didn't include it. So there was no loss associated with those where there should have been. They used a different cost basis. We used an average per the type of vehicle. So we did a more refined analysis with better information in our view, and that's why we had such a difference in our numbers.
That's you look at the numbers, and I don't think it's really acceptable to see that much of a difference in numbers. If you're quoting $462 in savings, I mean, I don't mind, $50,000 difference, but when you're looking at $300,000 difference, that's quite the difference. On page 4, you mentioned the review and purchase of sprinters was completed by Fleet Services, who informed the city manager's office that the purchase met the city's procurement bylaws and procedures. Was this an accurate statement, or do you feel it was misleading?
The procurement bylaw was followed in terms of they submitted, advertised through MERCS, completed requests for tender on a few of the procurements. They also did a request for standing offer. So all the rules, per se, for procurement were followed. The exception that we identified was around specifying a brand name or specifying, in this case it was Sprinter, which by virtue of doing that, you did specify a brand name through that term, because it was known as it was the only van that would meet that specifications would be Mercedes at that time. As I mentioned, the bylaw does have an exception where it's essential for city operations or other specific purpose. We did not find evidence of any support for that justification and felt that should be done for those types of purchases.
Thank you. I was also concerned what Councillor Wilkinson had brought forward to read a report that Transit Fleet and Facilities confirmed that they were not aware of motion passed at Council. Has any directions been undertaken so that this does not happen in the future? I mean, if this direction is given by Council, Council should automatically feel that it will be undertaken, and that information should be passed on to the appropriate authorities.
They have been advised, Councillor, so Transit now knows that they have to provide this information as well.
Thank you. As part of your review also, there was a cost analysis completed to compare the various vehicles available on the market. And if so, were the details of the review in regards to options available, gas usage, and other factors taken into account?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sure. As part of your review, was a cost analysis completed to compare various vehicles available on the market? And if so, were the details of the review in regards to the options available, gas usage, and other factors?
Mr. Chair, in the overall analysis that was conducted as a briefing note, there was a note around fuel savings, and we did acknowledge in the report that there were fuel savings with the diesel engines in the Mercedes in comparison to some of the replacement vehicles. However, looking at the procurement that followed, or the procurements that were done for individual replacements where it was a different, the Mercedes was a more expensive vehicle, we did not have any evidence provided on any value analysis, nor did we see when there were other vans on the market, the Nissan and the Ram in the 2012 and 2013 years. There was no analysis provided in terms of whether or not those were potential alternate options at a lower cost in compared to the Mercedes.
That's all the questions I have, Mr. Chair, on number 2.
Thank you, Councillor Manette. Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair. Merci. Just following up on a little bit of what Councillor Manette said, you said that, and I see it on page 3, the bullet point right before the end, 17 cents compared to an average fuel cost of existing vehicles of 25 cents per kilometer. But your point is that there was no analysis done of the various operating costs of replacement vehicles. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair. A fulsome value analysis on vehicles includes a life cycle cost. So that would include not only fuel, the capital cost of purchasing, but also repairs and maintenance for the life of that vehicle.
The full life cycle costs. Got it. So I guess my question Councillor Monette talked about the procurement bylaw. My question to management is that analysis required as part of the procurement bylaw?
The procurement bylaw states that there is to be a value analysis done, but I don't believe, and I'll ask Mr. McDonald to clarify this, I don't believe it states that it has to be provided to supply.
Mr. Chair, the bylaw indicates that consideration be given to completing a value analysis, and that value analysis be provided to supply to be placed on the procurement file.
Okay. Was that analysis done in this case?
My understanding is it was not done, and supply did not ask to receive one. It should be noted that the procurement staff are not technical experts and are not well positioned to challenge the technical requirements of the department, but our procedures will be updated to make clear what documentation needs to be provided and recorded on the file.
I guess my question is, given that it is part of the bylaw and analysis should be done, who would have been responsible to do that analysis?
Okay. Yes, correct. Fleet Services would do that analysis.
And it wasn't done in this case?
Not documented to the level that was requested by the auditor and will be in the future, so yes.
Okay. My other question is, with respect to recommendation 1, it refers to Fleet agreeing to the value analysis, but not Transit. Transit isn't mentioned. Will that be done?
The recommendation states that the city, so by virtue of the fact that it says the city, yes, Transit will do the same value analysis.
And I do recognize that Transit buys big buses, but they do have some light vehicles, so and not an insignificant number. So I would.
Yes, and we coordinate with them. They use a lot of times when we go out to tender, which is why they took the Mercedes Sprinter vans, because we had already gone out to tender for it, so it was already a standing offer that they could use, so it was easy for them to actually access those vehicles. So this, as they do tend to use our procurement vehicles, yes, they will perform the same value analysis.
One more question, Chair. How is a procurement like this, how is it initiated? Is it initiated with a request for a proposal? Is it a standing list? Do suppliers come see us? What happens right at the beginning?
So typically we would use a standing offer or a request for tender. And in this particular case, the reason why there's only one bidder is because the Mercedes was the only provider of that size of van we went out to market.
Okay.
If you look across the country, you'll see even like Vancouver bought 20 at the same time. There was almost 50 purchased in Calgary because of the same reason. It was the only size vehicle that met our needs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. So on item number 2, Office of the Auditor General, review of the city's practices for procurement of commercial vehicles. Is the recommendations received? Received. Thank you. So now we'll move on to item 1, which is the Office of the Auditor General's report on the Fraud and Waste Hotline. Councillor Wilkinson, I think you had a question on this? Fraud and waste. We're on the fraud and waste.
Briefly, Mr. Chair, just have to find it first. I just wanted, there's an awful lot of them looking at the numbers. There are a lot of ones that are either not valid or you don't have enough information. With the ones without enough information, do you actually try to follow up to get that information first before you actually drop them? Because sometimes people don't really understand everything that's going to be needed.
Mr. Chair, through you to the Council, that's an excellent question, and we absolutely do. The committee would be aware that the Fraud and Waste Hotline has a two-way communications function, which allows us to ask questions of the reporter. Now, that assumes that they check back. And if they check back, they see the question that they ask. And you're quite correct. Often when we ask for specifics like, could you give us the address of the location? Do you have any details around the particular vehicle? Sometimes we've had individuals who provide pictures. They just didn't give it to us or didn't even let us know that they had pictures when they made the report. But certainly this two-way communications allows us to ask for it, and there are some reports that come in with very little information, and we're able to glean to get more information that allows us then to pass the report on to investigate or investigate ourselves. But knowing that only half of the reporters check back in to the system, that means that there are some reports that are provided that without adequate information, because the individuals don't check in, we will never get that information.
But you don't actually reach out to actually reach them directly, you just post it. Because I think some people don't think about checking back in on written things.
Mr. Chair, the Councillor is absolutely right. 50% of the people don't ever go back to look at their report and look to see if there are any questions. But look, and we also see some reporters who will check back in, and even though we request additional information, we have those that will tell us that for particular reasons, the information, they won't provide the information because they're afraid of reprisal, or they're going to think about it. We've had individuals who have taken their time and have come back to us much later with additional information. There are all sorts of reasons why some people provide information later, and some people don't.
These 41's the one that are left after you. If you get more information and it's valid, you move them into one of the other categories, or?
That's correct.
So these are just the ones that you weren't actually able to action at all because you didn't have enough information.
Absolutely, and there's no tie other than sending a reply, sending a question back to the reporter through the system. There's no additional time spent on ones that don't have enough information. If we've got a pretty good idea of what management needs in order to pursue something, and the bulk of them we don't send through. From time to time, if it's an important issue that we think management may want to be aware of, even though there's not enough information, we will still send it through with the understanding that it's highly likely, with the information that they have, that they're not able to determine the cause, but in some instances, through their own resources, they've been able to find additional information and investigate.
When you say you send it in through the system, that's, I take as something online or something within the city website, or how does that system work?
It's Mr. Chair, it's an independent system. It doesn't involve the city website. It's an outside third party that operates the Fraud and Waste Hotline website, and we post our questions or comments and the eventual result of the report to the reporter, and but that of course requires them to log in. If they've provided a telephone number or an email address to the system, they will then get a notification that there's something there waiting for them in the system that they can check on. It's essentially a bulletin board that two people have access to, them and us.
So they are notified if you have contact information. But some of them I think that don't give you contact information.
Some people do not leave contact information. It's entirely up to them, but they can still because they're given an ID and a password, they can still log in to see what happens.
If they're ever like me, they probably lost the password the first day. But anyway, I don't know if there's any way to make it more. I don't know whether they're valid complaints or not, or just pie out the sky ones. But if there's anything that looks like it's quite significant, I take it you try to follow up a little harder than some of the others.
That's correct.
Okay. So I think thank you for that. I know that this is difficult to do. We get people contacting us in our office all the time without not enough information. So I understand the problem. It's difficult. So that's why and in all cases you said, or most cases, the management, you actually pass anything on that's with the department to the people in that department who do the analysis, and they then report back to you with what they find, or how does that work out? And do they have enough hands length sometimes?
Mr. Chair, it's correct. The bulk of the investigations, about 95%, are done by city staff. They pass the results on to us. Sometimes we have additional questions. More often than not, it's clear to us that the investigation is complete. There are times when we fully understand that they're going to come back and say, we just don't have enough information.
If somebody complains about their own manager, you go to somebody else to look into that, because you can't have the person investigating themselves.
Mr. Chair, where the complaint involves a named individual, we actually direct to the city manager's office that this not be sent to someone below a certain level, and the city manager's office acts accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. Councillor Elson-Tier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General and his team. Since we don't have Ombuds's report anymore, and I see our reporting is clearly. Have you sampled what other municipality in the case of best practice? Where are we? Because if I look at the number at the summary of the type of report, it seems in most cases are down from the past, which is it's a good sign for us. But how was other municipality of our size or in comparison? I'll be interested in that if you have some insight.
Mr. Chair, that's a good question from the councillor. We do look at how other hotlines operate, not just in other municipalities, but in other government agencies, in private and public corporations as well. One of the biggest problems that we have is there are still places that are implementing fraud and waste hotlines for the first time. So when we compare ourselves to others, especially those that are starting out, the volume in other places is lower. But when we compare ourselves to other entities that are mature, have mature hotlines like ours, the volumes are about the same. And what we see is the volumes fluctuate from time to time, and no one has yet been able to determine the cause of that. And I think if you look at our volumes, you can see that there's been, from the beginning, there was a sort of steady increase, and then it sort of leveled off, and there was a blip in 2015, and a little lower in 2016, and then the drop for this year. But you really don't see a trend until you've got a number of years. So, but it's a good question.
Well, thank you. It's good to hear, because one of the area we fail sometimes. So where we are today versus what we were before, even when it comes to fleet and fleet management and all this, we came a long way, and I think our staff doing a great job. I know we need to do better, but nevertheless, sometimes if we don't have that OMBI to compare with other municipalities, it seems like we don't have the full picture. Because it's nice to see, because if you talk about the numbers of vehicle and contracts and subcontract and lease and purchase and all that, and then you look how many, basically we can do better, it's still in comparison, is a small number. So the OMBI is I'm not sure how available to you, but I mean, it will be good to have a little bit of sample of comparison with other municipalities of our size to say, you know something, folks, this is the trend, or if there is a trend, or this is the sample of other areas. Just an idea to enlighten us when we look at something. At least we have a full picture.
We'll take that under advisement. Thank you,
Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councillor Al-Santeri. Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you, Chair. Merci. Monsieur le vérificateur général, sur la page 5, dommages réels ou potentiels à la personne, en anglais, harm to people or potential harm to people. There are 8 instances. Can you tell me what that is? Just generally, what does that category on page 5 in the table? Second item from the bottom, third item from the bottom.
Mr. Chair, I don't have the breakdown handy. Do you know
There are 8 instances on 192 versus 5 last year on 287. I just want to know, what is that category? Is that a...
for example, there were the cases of abuse in the long-term care home. We received a number of reports on that. They would be included in there. Basically anything that was indication of a physical nature.
Okay, towards an employee or
member of the public.
Whatever was reported. Okay, thank you. Just a couple of other questions. On page 6, and Councillor Wilkinson touched on this briefly, the 41 with insufficient information, but a little bit higher at the end of the paragraph, you have insufficient information to proceed with was 17. I just want to know, why does one say 41? Why does that say 17?
Very keen eye, Councillor. The 17, those are cases basically where we have so little information, we don't know what it related to. Say it's an open, the hotline is open to the public, so sometimes we receive, I'm not going to say gibberish, but things that we can't tell really what they're alleging, and so we go back to them and we ask them to clarify, and if we can't even make, we can't even categorize it, and so that falls into that category. Now, not all 17 are like that, because it includes ones that did not relate to fraud or waste. So I think there was a handful that fell into that category of 17. Then there were other ones where we did have enough information. We knew what they were talking about, but there was not enough information to investigate. Like we have, like you say, a vehicle in a park.
So it's different categories. It's not an error. It's okay. On page 8. The bullet point under violation of laws, there was a report in 2015, and then it looks like it was lost and it was picked up in 2017. What happened there? Does anyone have that? Or maybe that's for management.
Mr. Chair, I could certainly offer that there was a staff turnover, and I suspect that was behind the delay there. One of our practices is when a report has been outstanding for a while, we will go back to the city manager's office to ask for an update, and when we went back, staff picked it up again and completed the investigation.
Okay. I'm okay to wait for the answer at a later time or offline if...
Okay, did you have another question?
Yeah. My last question is with respect to qualifications, and one of the issues is engineers who are not engineers, and my question to management is what is our procedure for verification with respect to human resources, and when applications are made to the city, do we verify with the colleges, the applicable colleges or governing bodies?
So, Mr. Chair, following the auditor's recommendations, we did a sweep through all of the employees who had those requirements in their job descriptions and made sure that there was evidence on file that they had it. HR is now part of the hiring process, is asking for evidence. It could be a copy of the certificate that the person holds, or other. Most professional associations have online registries where they can go in and provide a screenshot to demonstrate current status.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Cloutier. I have a couple of questions for you, Mr. Auditor General. You mentioned the Fraud and Waste Hotline doesn't apply to Ottawa Housing or Ottawa Public Library, but I believe you are working with them to institute fraud and waste?
Mr. Chair, the Ottawa Library has their own fraud and waste portal, which is identical to ours. We worked with them, and they get a couple of reports a year. And Ottawa Community Housing has, within the last, I think, just over a year ago, opened their own portal, and that was implemented once again with our assistance, and they operate independently.
Great, thank you. Also, I wanted to ask you as a general question, are you concerned with the decrease in the number of fraud and waste reports that are coming in?
No, Mr. Chair, I think it's a reasonable question for anyone to wonder why we would see a decrease of a third. And in our presentation, we talked about all of the potential reasons that could be behind a decrease. I think the one reason that we didn't mention was just because. It's when you look at other reports from fraud and waste from similar hotlines, you see that the numbers change from year to year, and when you talk to the operators of these lines, there's often no reason they can put their finger on as to why the change is there. But what is incumbent on both management and the operators of hotlines is to ensure that they constantly make sure that their stakeholders, in this case employees and residents, are aware of not just the existence of the hotline, but how to access it. And then, of course, the fact that it's anonymous and confidential. And certainly reporting, one of the things that we do know is that when we report out with our annual report on the Fraud and Waste Hotline, we do see a little bit of an uptick, and it clearly indicates that some people are then either made aware of it for the first time, or see that the hotline works and that it's transparent.
Thank you. Now I got to ask you another question. I hope you're not too sensitive about it, but I got to ask, why are we looking at hockey sticks that are not city property? I get what you say about the value of sticks now. They're certainly worth a lot more, but what actually took us down that road?
Mr. Chair, the hockey sticks aren't city property, and the obvious question, it's a good question, why would we care about hockey sticks that don't belong to the City of Ottawa? The allegation that was made was that hockey sticks were being stolen, and that they weren't, and that staff weren't properly protecting their assets while they were at a city facility. When we investigated, we found no evidence that staff were stealing them, but what we did find was that the procedures for lost and found materials of any kind, including an expensive hockey stick, weren't being properly followed, and well, we didn't spend a lot of time investigating that once we determined that there was certainly no evidence that staff were involved in staff were stealing. We did point out to them that there was a policy that they should be following to ensure that if sticks did go missing, in other words, they were left somewhere where somebody was changing and somebody thought it was a lost stick and turned it in, then they should expect to be able to go to a lost and found and find it. And in that particular instance, we now know that staff are following the appropriate procedures.
Okay, and last topic on the fraud and waste from me. You report in here that there's 2 losses at the Client Service Center. This committee has spent a fair bit of time dealing with that in the past. Are these the same losses as reported out earlier, or new losses?
Mr. Chair, those are new losses.
New losses, okay. And is there any reason that we know of as to why we could not determine the cause of those losses?
Well, I think, Mr. Chair, when staff and when management and the Office of the Auditor General looked into these losses, one of the things that you do is you look at the video evidence, because we're aware that there are cameras in place, and we found in some cases, I'm going from memory for the past ones, we found that the video backup wasn't being retained, that it wasn't functioning properly. In other cases, the cameras weren't of a sufficient quality to facilitate an investigation, and in other cases, they weren't aimed at the appropriate places. So there were real questions with the video cameras, and we made a recommendation, and management committed to change the video cameras.
So from management, could I get an update on that, those recommendations? Like, have we installed the newer cameras, made sure that they're located at the right place? Have we done the training for staff so that they now know the procedures to have 2 people present, all that?
Thank you for the question, Chair. Yes, we have implemented all of the cameras in all of our sites. We have implemented all 34 recommendations that we've received from the auditor. To the best of our knowledge, the auditor will be in to review again to make sure that he's in compliance with that, but we believe we're in compliance with all the recommendations we've received.
Can you tell the committee, has that reduced the number of losses? Like, are you still experiencing losses as was reported out before?
Thanks again. We have not had any more losses since the ones that the auditor has brought forward today.
Congratulations, and thank you. Okay, that concludes my questions. Item 1, Office of the Auditor General, report on the Fraud and Waste Hotline, that the Audit Committee recommend Council receive this report on the Fraud and Waste Hotline. Is that accepted? Received? Okay, great. Thank you, folks. I don't believe there's any in-camera items. Notice of motions for consideration at subsequent meetings. Any motions? No. No inquiries. Thank you. Other business? No, we're good. Okay, motion to adjourn, please. There we go. Thank you, folks, for coming out. Have a great summer.
Happy Canada Day, everyone.
Yeah, happy Canada Day. Happy just summer. Yeah. Good luck, George. Hey, look at that for